Well, good morning, church. Welcome back to e-service. Last week we finished looking at Matthew chapters 8 and 9 and the three sets of three miracles there. And that dovetails right into Jesus sending his disciples out on mission in chapter 10. He says to pray to the Lord of the harvest that he'd send out workers into his field. And almost like as those disciples begin to pray that prayer, some of them realize they in fact are the ones who are called out into these fields that are so ripe to be harvested. And Jesus draws out of this larger group of disciples that is following him, the 12, and he sends them out with a specific mission that we'll begin looking at this morning. But what we'll actually be beginning this morning is a study on the 12 disciples or 12 apostles. But let's read the first 15 verses of Matthew 10, see a little bit about their mission, and then we'll circle back around and begin to talk about the disciples. So verse 1 of Matthew chapter 10. And when he had called his 12 disciples to him, he gave them power over unclean spirits to cast them out and to heal all kinds of sickness and all kinds of disease. Now the names of the 12 apostles are these. First, Simon, who is called Peter, and Andrew his brother. James, the son of Zebedee, and John his brother. Philip and Bartholomew, Thomas and Matthew the tax collector, James the son of Alphaeus, and Lebbaeus, whose surname was Thaddeus, Simon the Canaanite, and Judas Iscariot, who also betrayed him. These 12 Jesus sent out and commanded them, saying, Do not go into the way of the Gentiles, and do not enter the city of the Samaritans, but go rather to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And as you go, preach, saying, The kingdom of heaven is at hand. Heal the sick, cleanse the lepers, raise the dead, cast out demons. Freely you have received, freely give. Provide neither gold nor silver nor copper in your money belts, nor bag for your journey, nor two tunics, nor sandals, nor staffs, for a worker is worthy of his food. Now whatever city or town you enter, inquire who in it is worthy, and stay there until you go out. And when you go into a household, greet it. And if the household is worthy, let your peace come upon it. And if it is not worthy, let your peace return to you. And whoever will not receive you nor hear your words, when you depart from that house or city, shake off the dust from your feet. Assuredly, I say to you, it will be more tolerable for the land of Sodom and Gomorrah in the day of judgment than for that city. This is the word of the Lord. Now this is quite the commission. This is quite the mission that Jesus is sending these disciples out on. Up to this point, it has been Jesus teaching and preaching and healing. It has been Jesus at the very center of the stage of attention. And now, all of a sudden, he's sending out these 12 apostles to do some of the exact same things that he himself has been doing up to this point. So the question becomes, who are these men? Who are these men that Jesus is going to use this way? And immediately, the verb or the words change. Well, verbiage changes at the beginning of chapter 10. It says he called his 12 disciples to him. He calls these 12 disciples, and disciple means follower, to him. And then he gives them power over unclean spirits to cast them out, to heal all kinds of sickness and all kinds of disease. And then it says, now the names of the 12 apostles are these. And the word changes from disciple to apostle, from one who is simply a learner, a follower, to one who is actively sent out. And Ephesians 2:20 tells us of the 12 apostles that the household of God is built on the foundation of the apostles and prophets, with Jesus himself being the cornerstone. And so in the Old Testament, you have the 12 tribes of Israel. In the New Testament, you have the 12 apostles. We'll be talking more about this as we go through our study. But the apostles are the men through whom the ministry of the New Testament church really begins and is really built up on. They are the ones that are commissioned through the Holy Spirit to write most of the New Testament through divine revelation. It's their written down theology and doctrine that Christ taught through them, so that when the early church met together in the book of Acts, in Acts 2, it says that they were actually studying the apostles' doctrine. And so Jesus is commissioning these men and preparing them. He's calling them and sending them out for this very important mission. And this mission in Matthew chapter 10 is sort of a prelude to a greater mission. He'll send them out in waves. I don't know if you would want to look at this as a practice, but it's a different kind of mission. But before we get to the mission, we want to look at what, eventually we'll get to the mission and how it applies to us and what Jesus is commissioning them 4. But before we get to that, we want to look at these 12 men themselves. And they're listed for us here in Matthew chapter 10. And they're also listed in Mark 3, Luke 6, and Acts 1. And it can be difficult to get a grasp on who all of the 12 disciples or 12 apostles are and exactly what we can learn from them in the New Testament, because they're picked up. The story is obviously following Jesus, so they come in and out on the timeline. Some of them we hear hardly anything about other than their name being mentioned. Some of them we hear so much about that it's hard to wade through all of it and synthesize all the information that's coming down to us. So this is what we're going to be studying in the coming just few weeks leading up to Easter here. There won't be a sermon on every disciple, but certainly as we get to Peter being the first one, he has mentioned so much in the New Testament that you couldn't begin to scratch the surface of who Peter is and all that the Lord is teaching us through him without at least one sermon. So let me show you something significant among these lists that are in Matthew 10, Mark 3, Luke 6, and Acts 1. First is, as you'll notice here in Matthew chapter 10, where we're looking in verse 2, that Peter is always mentioned first in each of the lists. Now, each of the lists, the names of the disciples are given in a different order. And so it doesn't seem at first like maybe there's a rhyme or reason to the way the names are listed. But then we notice, first of all, Peter is always listed first in all 4 instances. And also, likewise, Judas is always listed last in each of the 4 instances. Now, it's very easy for us to understand why Judas would be listed last. And so conversely, it should be pretty easy for us to see why Peter is listed first. In fact, the word first is used here in verse 2. The names of the 12 apostles are these. First, Simon, who is called Peter. He seems to be, given the massive amount of information that's given to him, given to be that he is sort of the mouthpiece of the group and the uneven attention that he gets, he seems to be sort of the leader of the disciples. So that's interesting to point out. The other is that there's 3 groups of 4 disciples. And so we see that in this passage. Now, in Mark, it says Jesus sends them out 2 by 2. So it could be why Matthew groups them in 2s, but then the 2s are grouped into 4s. And so we are seeing here Simon, who's called Peter, and Andrew, James, and John as the first group, Philip, Bartholomew, Thomas, and Matthew as the second group, and James, Lebbaeus or Thaddeus, Simon, and Judas as the third group. And although the names are shuffled in the 4 listings of the disciples, of those 3 groups, the first name is always the same in each group. So they're always listed as Simon Peter being the first of the first group, and Philip being the first of the second group, and then James being the first in the third group. So it may be that the disciples were organized into 3 groups, and each group sort of had a head. It's likely, as I'm studying the New Testament, that maybe Jesus called his disciples sort of in phases, and the first group of 4 were called first and became part of Jesus' inner circle there with Peter and James and John. You can add Andrew to that. He rises to the surface a lot. And so maybe that group is primarily mentioned because they spent the most time with Jesus. And then the second group, you do get a little bit of information on, but not quite as much. And they were called second. And then the third group of disciples, other than Judas, who we only really know much about in a negative light, there's hardly any information about those disciples at all. So we'll look at Peter, who's listed first in all the lists and sort of rises to the surface as the leader of the disciples. Of course, Jesus is the leader of the disciples, but he's sort of the main disciple and the voice piece for the group. And you could preach months on Peter. So there's just so many different ways we could go. I just want to try and draw some application from what we see of Peter in the New Testament and especially in the Gospels. We know that Peter's known as being a man of action, that he's known for speaking out, sometimes putting his foot in his mouth. And he's known for his incredible declarations, but also his incredible denial of Christ. And Jesus identifies Peter as a disciple. He calls Peter as a disciple with purpose. And there's a reason that Peter, James, and John become the inner circle around Jesus. We know that. So what was it about Peter that made him rise to the top, that made him so useful to Christ? Why is it that Jesus chose Peter? And of course, the short answer is, I don't know. There's so much information about Peter. There's 100 different things we could earmark as worthy traits or traits that God could use. Which one is it that makes Peter so useful to Jesus? We don't know. And yet we hold that in tension with the fact that we know that Jesus can use anybody that he wants. And certainly the mission of the church wasn't ultimately dependent on Peter in an ultimate sense, right? So Peter's all throughout the New Testament, and there's no lack of things we can look at. But we can identify a few things. One is he asks a lot of questions. How many times should I forgive? 7 times? What's the reward of those for those of us who have left everything to follow you? Jesus explained to us what this deal about the fig tree means. If I'm going to be martyred, what about John? And the questions come on and on and on and on. Peter is always asking questions. And he was also always speaking. He seemed to be the first one to pipe up with answers as well. So when the Lord asks a question, he's the first to answer, who touched me? And Peter says, what do you mean? There's people everywhere, right? Who do you say that I am? And Peter says, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. Will you go away too? And Peter says, well, where else would we go? And it seems to be Peter is always the one with the question on his lips or with the answer to the question on Jesus's. And also, not only was he was always asking and he was always speaking, but he was always doing as well. He always seems to be in the center of the action. It was Peter who walked on water, and he gets a really bad rap for not having enough faith to stay afloat. And yet, you have to recognize that Peter was the one with enough faith to actually get out of the boat, and he was leaving the other disciples behind. It was Peter who denied Christ, and we see him right there in the account of the crucifixion. And yet, it was also Peter who denied Christ in the context of he was the one that was willing to go all the way to the house of the high priest. He was the first one inside Jesus' empty tomb, and the list goes on from there, right? We see Peter just in the middle of action all the time. He took lots of initiative. So what is it that makes this common fisherman born to a father who's a fisherman, able to be so powerfully used by God? He's seeking, he's answering, he's engaging. Are you doing that? Hopefully you are, right? You're never going to be used by God unless you're seeking and you're asking questions and you're engaging, right? And you're trying to follow the Lord. And I may be way off base here, but there's something else to me that stands out about Peter. And I've been so influenced by John MacArthur's book, 12 Ordinary Men. I'm looking at the disciples and trying to study the best I can. There's so much info here, it's hard to synthesize it all. But let's this morning look at something that really stands out to me about Peter. When I wrestled in high school, my wrestling coach would always tell me, you've got to be coachable. I can coach you until I'm blue in the face, but if you won't listen to what I'm saying and actually apply it on the mat, then it means nothing, right? You have to be coachable. And Peter was not perfect. That stands out to me in the text, but I want to push farther than that. Peter wasn't perfect, but he was teachable. He was coachable. And I think we'll be able to make that stand out this morning. Peter had 2 names. He's introduced to us here as Simon, who's called Peter. Simon was his given name, and Peter was the name that was given him by Christ, right? Which means stone, and that's a whole sermon in and of itself. But with that new name sort of came a new identity, and of course it's tied into Peter's great confession and Jesus talking about the foundations of the church. But it's interesting that where you see his old name, Simon, being used, it's generally in relation with just something common and not super spiritual. Simon's boat, Simon's house, Simon's this or Simon's that. Or, and this is not always exactly the rule, but it's usually used like that, or it's used in connection with some sin of Peter's. And I would liken that to the way my wife uses my second son's name. His name is Judah, but if he's in trouble, he's Judah Richard Paul, right? Well, you get something like that with Simon after the resurrection. When Jesus comes to Peter, who has betrayed him, he speaks to him 3 times saying, Simon, Simon, Simon. In Mark, when Jesus is praying in the Garden of Gethsemane and Peter falls asleep, Jesus says to him, Simon, are you sleeping? Could you not watch 1 hour? And the examples go on from there. Sometimes he's called Simon. Sometimes he's called Peter. Sometimes he's called Simon Peter. and his name isn't always used in exactly that kind of way, but I certainly see that kind of a thing happening in my life. Sometimes I do something or say something or think something, and I think to myself, that's the old Jason. That's the following Christ, saved, baptized, believing, heaven-bound, sanctified. That's the old Jason. Sometimes I do something and I think, that's what I like. That's what I like to see. I want to see Christ-like behavior in my life. This is the new Jason. And then sometimes I'm somewhere in between. And one thing that I'm encouraged to see in Peter's life for my own benefit is that he's not perfect. And so I can look at Peter and I can say, you don't have to be perfect to be used powerfully by God. But the other thing that I see of value in Peter's life is that he was coachable. So here's a question for us this morning. How would your life change if you never missed a lesson, if you never missed a practice, if in every experience in your life, if it was used, even your failures, to move you closer to God, into a place of more wisdom, into a place of more love for God or love for neighbor or fear of the Lord or burden for the lost? What would it look like if you never missed a lesson? I want to show you a few of the lessons that I think Peter learns throughout his walk with Christ. And I'll go through these really quickly, hopefully. But in Matthew 17:24, it says, when they come to Capernaum, those who received the temple tax came to Peter and said, so the whole group comes to Capernaum and they single out Peter and they say to Peter, does your teacher not pay the temple tax? And Peter said, yes. And when he had come into the house, Jesus anticipated him, saying, what do you think, Simon? From whom do the kings of the earth take customs or taxes? From their sons or from strangers? And Peter says, from strangers. And Jesus says to him, then the sons are free. Nevertheless, lest we offend them, go to the sea, cast in a hook, and take the fish that comes up first. And when you've opened its mouth, you'll find a piece of money. Take that and give it to them for me and you. Now, the indication here is that there's no money left in the purse. If Peter has to go to the ocean, bait a hook, throw it in, catch the first fish, open its mouth, and get the coin to pay the temple tax. So when Peter is asked, does your teacher not pay the temple tax? We only have a few options here. It could be that Jesus always paid the temple tax, and Peter expected there to be money for it in the purse and just thought Jesus hadn't paid it yet. It could be that Jesus always paid the temple tax, and Peter knew that the purse was empty, and this was an act of great faith to say that Jesus was somehow going to pay it anyways. Or it could be that Peter is embarrassed by the fact that Jesus has not paid the temple tax, and that he actually lies here. And that's why Jesus says to him, who do kings collect taxes from? Their sons or strangers? And Peter says strangers. And the implication here is that the Messiah doesn't have to pay the tax at the temple, but nevertheless, so they won't be offended, pay it anyways, Peter. This is a moment that shapes Peter's theology. And I want to say that I believe Peter was coachable, because when I look at his inspired writing in the New Testament, I can go to 1 Peter 2:13, and I can see this come to bear on his own writing to the church when he says, therefore submit yourselves to every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake, whether to the kings as supreme, or to governors, or to those who are sent by him for the punishment of evildoers and for the praise of those who do good. For this is the will of God, that by doing good you may put to silence the ignorance of foolish men, as free, yet not using liberty as a cloak for vice, but as bondservants of God. You see how coachable Peter is? I'll try to move quickly. Here's another example. In John 18, the Pharisees and Sadducees send a detachment of soldiers to arrest Jesus, and we're nearing the time of his crucifixion. And when they arrive to arrest Jesus, Peter pulls out a sword and he cuts off the ear of Malchus, one of the high priest's servants. And I would say, as a side note, Peter was not aiming for his ear. That was just all he was able to get. And Jesus says to Peter, put your sword into the sheath. Shall I not drink the cup which my Father has given me? Now, Peter, his theology, his way of thinking, his doctrine changes in that moment. It's a teachable moment. And we see this come out in 1 Peter 2:21 when he says, For to this you were called, because Christ also suffered for us, leaving us an example that you should follow in his footsteps, who committed no sin or was deceit in his mouth, who when he was reviled, he did not revile in return, and when he suffered, he did not threaten, but committed himself to him who judges righteously. Who does Peter hold out as an example? Not himself, who when threatened, or who when suffering did threaten, right? Instead, he commends Jesus as the example. This is a teachable moment for Peter, and Peter learned. In Matthew 26, third example, Peter says to Jesus, even if everybody else falls away, Lord, I never will. Supreme confidence, right? Borderline arrogance, because he's discounting what Jesus has just said. And Jesus says to Peter, Peter, before the rooster crows, you'll deny me 3 times. And what does Peter say in his epistle? 1 Peter 5:5, be clothed with humility, for God resists the proud, but he gives grace to the humble. And Peter he knows that through experience. In John 21, Jesus says to Peter, feed my sheep, and then he predicts his death. Most assuredly, I say to you, this is Peter's death, when you were younger, you girded yourself and walked where you wished, and when you are old, you'll stretch out your hands, and another will gird you and carry you where you do not wish. This he spoke, signifying by what death he would glorify God. And when he had spoken this, he said to him, follow me. Now, what's Peter's response in that moment? Peter doesn't say, to the death, Lord, I will do it. Lord, I'll never forsake you. I understand what it means now. Even if it means martyrdom, I will go. Instead, Jesus says, nevertheless, follow me. Peter looks around and it says he sees John. He says, what about him, Lord? What about him? And Jesus says, what about him? If I will that he remain till I come, what is that to you? You follow me. Maybe an embarrassing moment, maybe a tinge of shame, but Peter gets the lesson. And in 1 Peter 4:16, he says, but if anyone suffers as a Christian, let him not be ashamed, but let him glorify God in this manner. Peter, you follow me. One more example, John 13, Jesus is washing his disciples' feet. And John says he's done this to show his love to his disciples. Having loved his own who are in the world, he loves them to the end. And he begins to wash their feet. And Peter interrupts the whole object lesson. Lord, you're not going to wash my feet. And Jesus says, I have to. You have nothing to do with me. And then he says, then not my feet, but my whole body. And Jesus says, he who has had a bath doesn't need another one. He only needs his feet to be washed. And he finishes washing the disciples' feet after this whole tangent. And then we get to the point. He says, if I've done this for you, then you ought to be able to do this to each other. And the lesson is love each other. And after that bit of an embarrassing interjection, not that it wasn't a teachable moment in itself, because it was, we do find that Peter gets the lesson. And he writes in 1 Peter 4:8, and above all things have fervent love for one another, for love will cover a multitude of sins. Now, the culmination of all these teachable moments in Peter's life leads up to the book of Acts. And when you read through the first half of Acts, Peter is everywhere. And he's applying everything that he's learned, and he's become the man that Jesus has turned him into. And we see him before the Sanhedrin especially, preaching powerfully, proclaiming Christ. And they tell him to stop, and he says, I have to obey God, not men. And then he goes in to a prayer meeting, he prays for even more boldness, and he goes out and he keeps preaching. But while he's before the Sanhedrin, this is what they say about him. Before he leaves the Sanhedrin, in Acts 4:13, it says, now when they saw the boldness of Peter and John and perceived that they were uneducated and untrained men, they marveled and they realized that they had been with Jesus. What would our lives look like if we never let a teachable moment slip by? How would our life change if we never missed a lesson, never missed a practice, if every experience in our life was used, even our failures, to grow our love for Christ, to grow our patience, to grow our burden for the lost, to grow our fear of the Lord, to love our neighbors better every single moment? Let's endeavor to make that true in our lives.